With the recent surge in the number of COVID cases in the US and Europe, it has caused some parts of Europe to semi-lockdown again, which has spooked many investors as there could be a small chance of a potential lockdown in the US if things continue to get worse, as investors see the US about several weeks behind Europe when it comes to COVID. With these new headlines of Europe locking down, it has caused the markets to pull back significantly. Two stocks that's on my radar is Visa and Mastercard. They recently pulled back with the overall markets to an interesting level. So in today's video, I want to take a look at both and determine which one is a better buy. But before I begin, I just want to say I'm not a financial advisor, so please do your own due diligence before investing. So right off the bat, we can see that Mastercard is about 3/4 the size of Visa, but overall, these two dominate the market. Visa and Mastercard's primary business model is payment processing. It doesn't issue any credit cards themselves, it acts as the middleman and processes the transaction and charges a fee. The business or bank that issues the credit card is the one that lends the money and holds onto the debt. So overall, it's a very profitable and a very high margin business. We can see that overall, the dividend payment and yield is very low for both companies based on their stock price. But that's because they trade at a very high premium, with Visa trading at a trailing PE ratio of over 37 and Mastercard at over 43. That's right, over 37 and over 43. Mastercard is trading at a premium to Visa because investors are expecting Mastercard to grow at a faster pace than Visa. First, I want to take a look at Visa's quarterly revenue and growth, but one thing I would like to point out is I've adjusted it to make this comparison more equal to Mastercard, because Visa's quarterly report dates are slightly different. Their first quarterly report is usually the fourth quarter of the year, and their second quarterly report is the first quarter of the year. Mastercard, on the other hand, is more traditional, I guess, where their first quarterly report is the first quarter of the year, and the second quarterly report is the second quarter of the year. Very simple. So I've adjusted Visa's quarterly report and yearly report to match that of Mastercard, so we get more of an apple-to-apple comparison. Now onto the numbers. We can see that in 2018, quarter over quarter, revenue has gone up. In 2019, Q1 versus Q4 of 2018, it was pretty much flat. Q2 and Q3 went up nicely, but we noticed a small dip in Q4. In 2020, Q1 versus Q4 of 2019, we notice another drop of about 3.3%. But Q2 is where we really see the impact of the coronavirus, and we see a significant drop in revenue numbers. But the recent quarterly report in Q3, we notice a slight increase, but still much lower than before the pandemic. Now when we compare that to Mastercard, in 2018, Q2 and Q3, we see an increase in revenue, but in Q4's revenue numbers, it did drop down a bit. In 2019, Q1 versus Q4 of 2018 was fairly flat as well, but we do notice more growth in Q2 and Q3 compared to Visa, with a small drop in Q4. But unlike Visa, in Q1 of 2020 versus Q4 of 2019, we notice a decent drop in revenue numbers of about 9.2%. And just like Visa, we see a big impact on the revenue numbers in Q2 because of the coronavirus. But we have a much nicer growth in the recent quarterly report. This chart will compare the same quarterly report of each year. And before the coronavirus, each quarterly report of that year's revenue number has gone up. When we compare this to Mastercard, we can see slightly higher growth in Mastercard in the recent few years. When we compare the yearly revenue growth, we can see that it was only within the last few years that Mastercard was growing faster than Visa. In 2016 and 2017, Visa was outgrowing Mastercard by a few percent, and in 2018, Mastercard beat Visa by quite a bit. Mastercard had growth of just under 20% compared to Visa's growth of just over 13%. And again in 2019, Mastercard beat Visa by a few percent. And right now, for 2020, the revenue decline is fairly high. I just want to note that the revenue numbers for 2020 only contains up to 3 quarters. But of course, I compared it to the 3 quarters of 2019 to be fair. Now after going over the recent several years, I want to take a look at longer historical data, first with the revenue numbers, which I think for Visa and Mastercard is very important since their profit margins are so high and very close to each other. Whoever grows the revenue numbers faster will indeed grow the profit numbers quicker as well. Overall revenue numbers has been increasing year over year, but we probably will see a decline this year because of COVID. But more importantly, let's look at who's growing faster and if Mastercard warrants the extra premium. Initially, let's ignore the few outlier points in Visa, and we can notice that in the past decade, that Mastercard hasn't always grown faster. There are times when Mastercard drops significantly. It's more volatile. Can Mastercard continue to outgrow Visa? Of course, but can it come back down or maybe slow down? Yeah, why not? Their yearly profit chart looks a little different than the revenue chart. We've seen some pretty significant dips in Visa in 2007, 2012, and 2016, and 2008 for MasterCard. But in 2018, both Visa and MasterCard really grew their profits. And in 2019, MasterCard continued to outgrow Visa in profits, where Visa came back down to their more normal growth. We can see a clearer picture when we look at their profit growth chart. In the past, they've been below 20% most of the time. But in 2018 and 2019, MasterCard grew the profits by around 50 and 40% respectively. Visa, on the other hand, grew around 50 and 15% respectively. So MasterCard maintained their really high growth in 2019. But of course, they are both going to take a hit this year, with MasterCard taking a slightly bigger hit when we compare Q1 to Q3 of 2020 to Q1 to Q3 of 2019. MasterCard's profit dropped about 23% versus Visa's 17%. Their earnings per share looks very similar to their profits, but we are expecting a drop in EPS for 2020, and I'm guessing that Visa will be slightly below their 2018 EPS numbers, but for MasterCard, I'm expecting to be slightly above their 2018 EPS numbers. When looking at their EPS growth, their chart looks identical to their profit growth, and again, just like their profit growth so far in 2020 compared to 2019, MasterCard's EPS numbers have dropped about 22% versus Visa's 15%. This is of course just comparing the first 9 months of 2020 to the first 9 months of 2019. The number of shares outstanding over the decades has been slowly going down, and it may look like Visa is making more progress than MasterCard in buying back more shares, but that's because it started at a higher base, so it looks more drastic than MasterCard. But overall, the difference is very insignificant, with maybe a slight edge to MasterCard, depending on how far you want to look back. Their business model has great profit margins, and we see the profit margins grown slightly over the past decade. But during the last couple of quarters, when coronavirus really hit the travel industry, we saw a decrease in the cross-border transaction, which hit Visa and MasterCard's profits. We are expecting a decrease in profit margins for 2020, with MasterCard maybe in the low 40s and Visa in the high 40s. The amount of dividend they pay is very small compared to their stock price, at around 0.5%. Even though the dividend payment is so small, they're paying about 1/4 of their profits out. It's because their valuation is so high that the yield is so low. Their annualized dividend growth has been spectacular at over 20% annually, and when this pandemic is over and their growth resumes like before, they shouldn't have any problems growing their dividend at 20% annually for some time. When looking at their yearly dividend growth, we notice a big spike up in MasterCard's dividend growth back in 2011 and 2012, but since then it has come back down and they are averaging at about 20% yearly for the past 5 years. Even though they've been growing their dividends at about 20% yearly, their payout ratio has maintained steadily below 25%, which means that they've been able to grow their EPS at about the same rate as their dividends. But we might see a slight move up over 25% for 2020 because of the pandemic. When we look at the long history of their stock performance, we can see that MasterCard and Visa has outperformed the S&P 500 by far, with MasterCard even outperforming Visa. But if we look at a shorter time frame, say about a year, their performance has been much closer to each other. Their annualized return over the years has been spectacular, and only being dragged down by the recent negative performance this year. But even then, MasterCard's annualized return has been above 20%, and Visa's annualized return above 15%, with the exception of 2020 for both. Their yearly return follows a very similar trend to each other, with MasterCard on top, but we can see about a decade ago they had exceptional returns at around 40+% for several years, and again we see this exceptional return in 2017 and 2019, but it looks like this year will be more muted. And lastly, I want to look at their historical PE ratio, and we see that over the decades, both Visa and MasterCard have seen their PE ratios expand a lot, with their PE ratio starting in the low 20s back in 2009 and expanding all the way to over 40 for MasterCard in 2020 and over 35 for Visa. In the past, we have seen Visa trade at a higher multiple than MasterCard, but the recent several years, we have seen MasterCard's multiple grow much faster and have overtaken Visa's. So in my personal opinion, which one do I like more? MasterCard has been outgrowing Visa in the recent several years. They really beat Visa in 2018 and slightly in 2019, but before then, Visa was on top, and they are expecting MasterCard to continue to outgrow Visa. Since there is more growth in MasterCard, it should trade at a premium to Visa, but it's not a small difference, with Visa trading at a PE ratio of over 37 and MasterCard at over 43. MasterCard is smaller than Visa, so there is more market share they can gain from Visa, but the question is, would it be significant enough to warrant that extra premium? I also want to mention that if you purchase at today's prices, and when they do recover back to the 2019 levels, at today's prices, with their 2019 EPS numbers, they would be trading at a PE ratio of slightly over 34 and 36 for Visa and Mastercard. If you look at it that way, the difference doesn't seem as great and may warrant that slight extra premium, but that's assuming they recover back to their 2019 levels at around the same time. Overall, I think that they are both great companies, and it doesn't hurt owning a mixture of both, and you can't be wrong with either pick. But for me personally, I think I might lean or give a slight edge to Mastercard because of the greater projected growth and the greater stock performance, but that's just my own personal opinion. Let me know down below which one is your favorite and which one do you own, or do you own both? And as always, if you found this video informang or if you learned something valuable, please like and share the video. I really appreciate it because making this video takes a lot of time and really helps out the channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please make sure to smash the subscribe button, and thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.